present study that we reviewed here was mental rotation of objects from memory, a functional MRI study of spatial processing. This was done by myself, Addy, and Muhammad. This is the information regarding the people that actually performed the study. The study was done to observe how various types of computational demands affect the activation in a large-scale network of cortical regions that are involved in mental rotation. That's going to make more sense once we get into the actual nitty-gritty of the study. The study was based off a study by Shepard and Metzler, in which they showed visual cues to participants, and they had to rotate a picture in their head between two different axes, and then they measured the activation. The goal of the present study was to determine how various aspects of mental rotation affected the pattern of activation in several cortical regions. The key thing that they added here was that they added onto the two axes the condition that you might be asked to rotate both ways, and we'll get into more of that later. The present study was also concerned with input modality, so whether you saw a visual cue or heard an auditory cue to rotate the image. So the two axes that we talked about earlier were the Y and the Z. The Z-axis is rotating it on the two-dimensional plane. So picture just looking at a piece of paper, seeing a two-dimensional clock, and seeing it rotate either clockwise or counterclockwise. The Y-axis is imagining that same clock, but rotating in depth of the paper, so in the other direction in a sort of three-dimensional orientation. The researchers had three hypotheses. One was that a change in rotation axis from one rotation to the next should be more computationally demanding than making successive rotations around the same axis. So if you tell them to rotate around the z-axis and then the y-axis, that should show more activation in the brain than just doing one axis. The second hypothesis basically says that the more rotations that you're asked to do, the more computation that your brain needs to do, so the more activation that you'll see. And the third hypothesis concerned the effect of input modality, so whether or not you heard a visual or auditory cue. They hypothesized here that you would get the same amount of activation in the parietal lobe regardless, because that's just based on spatial reasoning. However, you might see dissimilarities in the sensory and perceptual areas, like the temporal lobe. So there are 12 total participants. They were all right-handed. Whether or not that matters, it doesn't seem to. There were 7 males and 5 females. An initial screening was performed on a larger group of potential candidates, which consisted of an abbreviated behavioral version of the mental rotation task. So it was a more simpler task, and only participants who had less than 40% error rate in their responses were chosen to move on to the final study. So here's a picture of the brain. The important thing here is when they were placed in the fMRI that it was positioned so it would get more information from the parietal and the temporal lobe. And the variables. The variables were as follows. The axis of rotation that had 3 levels. The z-axis, which was the two-dimensional plane, clockwise or counterclockwise. The y-axis, which was the rotation in depth, and dual axis, in which you were asked to do both. There was also problem length, in which you were asked to do either 2 to 3 rotations or 4. The 4 was called the long path, and the short was the 2 to 3 steps. So there were a total of 6 unique conditions, or as the researchers called them, epochs in the study. So the researchers used blood oxygen level contrast imaging with the fMRI to assess the activation in specific areas of the brain. If you look on the picture on the left, it depicts how activated neurons absorb more oxygen than unactivated ones. A little background on that, and then on the picture to the right, the areas that are reddish-orange are more activated than the blue areas. So the reddish-orange areas have more oxygen. They're more active. So based on their prior study, they gave the participants 3.2 seconds for the first rotation, 2.2 for subsequent rotations with the same axis, and 5.7 if they changed the rotation after the first rotation. So that's for the dual. So participants were shown this canonical position of the clock, and then it was taken away from them. They were placed in an MRI with a screen in front of them, and they were presented with a ready text for 1.5 seconds. Then they had a short interval in which they were asked to visualize the clock that they were shown earlier from memory in the canonical position. The tasks for rotating were presented verbally by specific cues. For example, the cue clock meant to rotate the object on the z-axis, so in 2 dimensions, clockwise. At the end of a problem, a picture of a clock in a specific orientation was shown, and the participants were to ask how accurately they believed they rotated it, if they got it correct, basically. So the results. The fMRI results showed activation or blood oxygen level contrast from the parietal areas, which is the spatial reasoning temporal areas, inferior frontal gyrus, the IFG, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, and the frontal eye fields. They were mostly interested in parietal and somewhat temporal, also maybe a little bit of the DLPFC, which will be explained later, and that's also goal-oriented part of the brain. So overall, they found that the multi-axis variable, the Y and the Z, generated much more activation, as they had predicted, from the different parts of the brain, especially the parietal, and the rest of the parts of the brain kind of followed suit as well, except for the temporal lobe, which we will get to in a little bit. There was also significantly more activation for longer paths, as they had predicted, and overall there was more activation in each left section of each part of the brain, which has more to do with spatial recognition. Here are the graphs showing that. As you can see in the parietal lobe, the dual was higher in each section of the parietal lobe. You'll also notice that the left sections had more activation in general. The same was found for the path length as well, as they had predicted. They found the same results for the IFG and the DFC. And here is actually where they had their anomaly. As you can see, the dual axis actually had less activation than the single axis in both sides of the brain. They also had more activation in the right side of the temporal areas. This is likely due to more auditory stimuli, as there were more inputs with a single plane condition. So they were given more auditory cues if they just had a single plane condition, and they had to do that over and over again. And there was no effect of input modality, so whether or not it was visual cues or auditory cues on the parietal activation. That was also as they had hypothesized. The 3 main conclusions that they drew was that when you rotate an object, a 3-dimensional object, it doesn't occur in a true 3-dimensional space in your brain. Also, more computational power needed for repeated rotations, so the more you rotate, the more work your brain does. That one is kind of intuitive. And 3, that the parietal contribution is similar regardless of input modality. So as they predicted, that it didn't matter in the parietal lobe whether you heard or you saw the stimulus that told you to rotate. So these pieces of research also kind of backed up the fact that the rotation happens in a 2-dimensional array. The first suggests that it is easier to rotate an imagined object in a 2-dimensional array than it is in a 3-dimensional array. The Hemingway and Palmer study claimed that 3-dimensional interpretations of drawings can actually be more effortful than 2-dimensional. And the third study shows that computation of a 3-dimensional space requires more activation than of a 2-dimensional space. This seems counterintuitive, which is interesting to me because our world is in 3D, but to perform complex tasks from memory, our brain has to simplify it down into 2 dimensions and then rotate it, especially if it's asked to do 2 things at once. And extra mental work is pulled from other areas like the DLPFC. That's the goal-oriented section of the brain. That kind of shows that each area is interconnected, and if a complex task is needed to be done, that it might pull effort from other parts of the brain as well. And it was well done how they incorporated the different regions in the brain. I thought that was a lot of really cool information. I think in the future they could use a larger sample size. I just think 12 was kind of small. that pretty much does it for our study, and I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something.